I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Shima Hamidi. And I had hoped to maybe ask if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. If I'm not, I would like her to correct me when she gets up here. But we are pleased to have her talk with us about her recent research on road diets. She is a Bloomberg Assistant Professor of American Health and Environmental Challenges in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at Johns Hopkins. Before joining the Bloomberg School, Dr. Hamidi was the director of Center for Transportation Equity, Decisions and Dollars, a $7.5 million center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation at the University of Texas at Arlington. She's done extensive research on the negative consequences of car-oriented community design on public health and climate change. She's written 2 books and over 40 journal articles on urban sprawl and its impacts on individuals' economic mobility, traffic safety, life expectancy, obesity and inactivity, emergence of food deserts, crime rates, and air quality. I will also say it really lit up the socials when your article was covered by many mass market magazines earlier this year. And we're excited to have you. So, Dr. Hamid.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and it's great to be here. I'm going to talk about street design, safety, and lane width today, but in my way to making this presentation happen, I was thinking we should definitely do a parking study. It's maybe as important as safety. But anyway, I'm a Bloomberg Professor of American Health. I do study transportation, safety, street design, how really we can make our streets and neighborhoods safer, more walkable and livable and bikeable for everyone. So this study is one of the most recent studies we've done funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies and Center for Climate Smart Transportation, which is a center funded by US DOT, $10 million center. I'm also the director of this center. And this is one of many, many studies we are going to do in the next 5 years to look at transportation challenges of Maryland and what actionable research and actionable plans can be done to address that. Next slide, please. So, next. Let me start with a couple of mind-blowing facts. Only in 2021, about 43,000 deaths from car accidents happened in the US. Almost 10 times higher than other European countries. 10 times higher. Next slide. It's even worse for pedestrians and cyclists. 2020 marked the deadliest year for pedestrians in 40 years, recording pedestrian fatalities in the history. 46% increase in pedestrian fatalities just between 2010 and 2019, just in 9 years. 46% increase. Next slide. The same applies for bike safety. 44% increase in the number of bike-related fatalities between 2010 and 2020. And 70% of those fatal crashes happened at non-intersection, which means factors such as the shape of streets, number of lanes, presence of bike lane, and factors such as lane widths, travel lane widths, could make a huge difference to address this 70%. Next slide, please. Next. A big part of these numbers are because because of the way we've been designing our streets and neighborhoods, which is really, it's interesting to think about the logic behind that forgiving design paradigm, which says we should design our streets in a way that minimizes drivers' errors. If it minimizes drivers' errors, then it probably, if they make an error, there's going to be less consequences. But it really forgets the most vulnerable users of streets, pedestrians and cyclists. They become second priorities. Car-oriented street design, lack of pedestrian and cyclist facilities is the main reason behind those numbers. Next slide, please. One of the main factors is lane width. Have you noticed how wide are our lanes and streets? Much wider than other countries. I'm talking about, like, here we are talking about the minimum lane width of 11 to 12 feet. In Europe, the average lane width is 8 feet. Just look at the difference. Do you know, if we just reduce these lanes by just 1 foot, it would be enough space to add a bike lane. But why we are making these lanes so wide? If you ask traffic engineers, they would say wider lanes are safer. That's really what we wanted to see, if the data says that wider lanes are safer. And if not, what can be done to best use that limited space in the street to accommodate everyone, bicyclists, pedestrians, as well as drivers. So we did one of the most comprehensive studies to date, a national study, 7 cities included in this study, more than 1,100 streets from these 7 cities. If you look at other studies, they are looking at 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 streets. This study includes 1,100 streets. Next slide, please. And more than 23 safety factors. We measured 23, anything you can imagine, from sidewalks to bike lanes to if there is any median or other traffic calming, pedestrian crosswalks, you name it. Anything that deals with the design of the street that could be linked to safety in addition to lane widths. So I'm gonna share very briefly what we found. We found that actually wider lanes are not safer than narrower lanes. In many cases, they actually are more dangerous. 12-foot lanes tend to have higher number of crashes than 9 and 10-foot lanes when you keep everything else constant. It's even, next slide, please. It's even more interesting when you look at streets in the speed limit class of 30 to 35 miles per hour. These streets are the streets that have the most potentials to be used by pedestrians and cyclists. They are mostly in downtown areas, areas that are businesses, or areas that people typically have daily travel to. In these streets, in almost any lane width that you look at, wider lanes are more dangerous than narrower lanes. Wider lanes have higher number of crashes, and they have more severe type of crashes. Why do you think is the reason? I mean, I'm talking about 50 years of street design based on the fact that wider lanes are safer. Well, Wider lanes actually tend to give drivers the false sense of, if you make a mistake, there's not going to be much consequences. So they tend to drive faster. And that speed is the main reason behind crashes, higher number of crashes. When streets are narrower, drivers tend to be more precautious. They drive based on the sense they get from the street, not based on speed limit. If you design streets wider and want to just enforce speed limit, you have to have 24/7 law enforcement in place. But if you design it narrower, then the street just gives the drivers the sense that you gotta be careful. You gotta drive slower. And that's the reason behind these improvements in safety. So how we can make it happen? We interviewed many departments of transportation in the country, and they kind of struggle in the implementation, how we can plan for narrower streets. Are there real examples of successful examples that we can look at? I want to show you 3 successful examples of narrowing lanes and what impacts they brought to the community. Next, please. So this is the first one. It's from Vermont, and it's a street that I was mentioning that the average lane width in the US is 11 to 12 feet. Here you have lanes that are 17 feet. Just think about how wide they are. And the designers of this street, they thought, we have a slope on one side of the street, and so maybe that it doesn't make sense to have a sidewalk there. So how about making streets wider? But then this street went through the redesign process and reconfiguration process. They changed lane width to 10, added a sidewalk, added 2 bike lanes using the very same space. And it improved significantly the safety of streets for pedestrians and cyclists. Much more pedestrian and cyclist visits and activities happen in this street after these changes. Next slide, please. This is another case, and next. Again, so we can see the whole slide. Perfect. Another example from Florida. So this was one of the relatively dangerous streets with high numbers of pedestrian and bicyclist crashes. And what Florida DOT did was to kind of narrow the lanes in the streets from 12 to 10 and add 2 bike lanes, each of them 4-foot bike lanes. And then they looked at what did it mean for this street. There are a bunch of, this one of the studies that did a before and after analysis. A bunch of changes, but the most important one, the level of stress for cyclists and pedestrians changed from 4 to 0. From the scale of 4 being the highest to 0. And again, a substantial change on the landscape of extent to which pedestrians and cyclists could use these streets. Next. The last example is from Delaware, Cleveland Street. And next. If you look at these streets, they didn't change lane widths, but they got rid of one whole lane. It was a 4-lane street. They got rid of one lane, added a center turn lane and another 2 lanes, one on each way, and plus 2 bike lanes and wider sidewalk. And what they found was that drivers' speed was reduced by 4 miles per hour and a huge improvement in safety of pedestrians and cyclists. Next. So the overall takeaway, what does it mean? What does it mean for Maryland? Maryland is not an exception. If you look at, I'm coming from Colombia. If you look at streets, there are relatively wide, much wider than what they should be in order to have the same traffic flow. And you don't see much pedestrian and cyclists. It's really not safe. I work in Baltimore City, Johns Hopkins University, and many of my colleagues would like to bike to school, but they just can't do it. Even though it's a bikeable distance, you know, they live like in 1 mile or 1.5 miles away from the university, they just can't do it because of the safety reasons. Changing lane widths is probably the easiest, cheapest, most cost-efficient way to change these patterns. Much cheaper than any other solution to add bike lane. And it can even get better if you couple that with other improvements in bicycle and pedestrian safety, particularly for bicyclists, traffic calming measures, anything that help to make street calmer and more welcoming for cyclists would make a huge difference. And next slide, please. It's not only about safety. You probably know about the rate of obesity in the US. More than 41% of US populations are obese. One of the main reasons is that our neighborhoods and streets do not provide opportunities for being physically active. It's just not safe, it's not bikeable, it's not walkable. And this lane width reduction could change this paradigm. It has economic benefits. Studies show that adding bike lane could make return on investment for businesses higher. It's cost effective, it's environmental friendly, less in previous surveys, less likelihood of urban heat island, benefits for climate change, equity impacts. If you think of like most of these wider lanes are in underserved and minority neighborhoods, and what does it mean for those neighborhoods to have a safer environment for cyclists and pedestrians? It will bring inclusive street use and street design, you know, a street that's usable for everyone and is welcoming for everyone. And so, yeah, that's what we've been doing in the past few months to really work with transportation officials, cities, departments of transportation, states departments of transportation, mayors, council members, to really look at how we can make it happen, how we can find the best candidates for lane width reduction in their cities, how we can work with them to change lane width design standards for future street design in those cities. And really how we can help them to get best out of that lane width reduction project, best use. What is the best way of turning that in a way to help cyclists and pedestrians use the street. So we've got tons of interest from different cities and local governments and state departments of transportation, and I hope to be able to work with as many of them, including cities in Maryland and the state of Maryland, to really make changes in the street design and street design guidelines. Thank you, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. It's always good to have data, and I really appreciate the depth of data that you guys gathered. We have just a few moments for questions, and because of the mic and because we are recording, I'll repeat the question back. So if you...
So I'd like to understand, when you put those bike lanes in there, what kind of increase in numbers of people actually using it to go ahead and actually do it? Because one of the biggest challenges I have is that people are looking for dedicated bike lanes off-road, and they're not really all that keen on using the in-road thing. So I'd like to understand how much impact this has in increasing bicycling in those lanes.
Sure.
So the question was, what has your team seen in terms of usership numbers for lanes that are incorporated into roads? The person asked the question said that they've seen people liking ones that are completely off-road a little bit more, and wondering what data she found.
So having a dedicated bike lane is important, not necessarily off-road. It can just have some physical, there should be some physical divisions between where traffic flow has and the bikers flow. There should be a physical division between them. The two should not conflict. And what you mentioned is actually supported by many studies that said just a simple bike lane doesn't work. There is not much safety improvement just by adding a bike lane. Is most often is being used by drivers and doesn't give much safety to cyclists. You've got a plan for dedicated bike lane, and it's not much more space. It doesn't need much more space. It just needs to have a physical barrier, and that is what is one of our recommendations.
John?
Sure. Cities, counties, and states all have road design manuals that they use and tend to adhere to whatever the manual says. I just wonder if you've done any studies about changes in the actual road design manuals. It seems like that's where it would start to get them to actually start implementing the approaches you prescribe.
So the question was, have changes been made to actual road design manuals? There are many different ones across the United States, and
that is actually a great question. There has been interest in changing these manuals. Some states or cities even done that. Example is Florida DOT. So typically cities or states update these design manuals every few years, every 5 years or so. And in the most recent update, Florida DOT has changed their design manuals significantly to accommodate 9-foot lanes in their streets, actually encourage 9 and 10-foot lane, and ask their traffic engineers to justify if it needs to be wider in places that they need, narrower lane widths. And it's absolutely possible. When you talk with people who are behind these design manuals, they would say there is not enough evidence and data that shows us, narrower lanes are safe, are okay to go with. And that was one of the motivations behind this study. Now we have data. So how about using this data and incorporating these findings, just really listening to what the data says, incorporating that into design manuals. Much easier to do that at the city level. At the state level, more probably paperwork and meetings and all of those justifications required, but I'm aware of several cities that are actually thinking about this lane width design reduction and changes in manual, including Salt Lake City in Utah, which was a partner in this study.
I will say what she just said is what motivated me to serve on Pike, Maryland, because we really need this at the state level here in the state. Other questions? In the back.
Hi. Given how wide our lanes are, adding more, acreage or square feet of surface, and knowing that for every square foot of road you build is another square foot of road you have to maintain. I know anecdotally that on the Eastern Shore, many of our towns use American Rescue Plan funds just to resurface our roads, which blows my mind that we use once in a generation pandemic emergency federal funds for basic infrastructure maintenance. Did your research show any indication for the amount of American Rescue Plan funds used across the U.S. or even throughout the state of Maryland on just road maintenance?
So the question was expressing concern about the amount of money that road surfacing takes up, and especially about, tell me the name again,
The American Rescue Plan.
American Rescue Plan funds. And did she find evidence of American Rescue funds being used for road widening and or the economic impacts that lane narrowing might have?
We haven't specifically looked at financial aspects of this project, but what I can say from other studies is that, again, the construction and maintenance costs of lane narrowing and adding bike lane is way smaller than again, other solutions to adding a bike lane to the street. Again, is not an answer to your question. We haven't looked at those aspects of lane width, but I just wanted to use this opportunity and say that I'm talking about a huge difference in cost saving when you talk about lane width reduction and adding that, using that extra space for bike lanes rather than other alternatives.
Mike.
Did your research by any chance look at instances where lanes were narrowed near transit, bus stops, trains, whatever, and what effect that had on ridership?
The question was, did the study examine connections to transit? Did it have any impact if the lanes were changed close to transit stops?
Actually, this is a good question. So in those design manuals, there are two places, and research also supports this. There are two scenarios that we do not recommend lane width reduction. One of them is transit, because transit vehicles are typically larger, wider, and it actually narrower lanes in places that are transit corridor could actually be dangerous. And so in transit corridors, we still recommend 11-foot lanes. The other similar scenario or example is freight corridor. So those vehicles are also typically larger. So streets that are either freight corridor or transit corridor still needs to be relatively wider. 11-foot is what we would, our study would recommend for those cases.
And I'd like to ask a clarification on that. When you're saying the transit corridor still needs to be wider, do you mean that entire road or the lane that transit is assigned to? Because one of the big pushes right now in the state of Maryland, particularly in the county where I live, Montgomery County, is to have dedicated bus rapid transit lanes so one could envision where that lane might be wider, the other ones narrower. Can you clarify a little bit?
Yeah, that's definitely the best possible scenario, to have a dedicated lane for transit and make it 11 foot and then kind of separate that from the remaining traffic. In places that you have narrow roads, you can do that. Then again, we would recommend to consider 11 foot as the standard.
Thank you for that clarification. Are there other questions? Yes.
I understand the logic of narrower lanes being safer. When one narrows lanes, do you also lower the speed limit at the same time, or or does it make any difference?
When a lane is being narrowed, is the speed within it also brought down? And I think the question meaning like the official posted speed limit is what you're asking.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
It's actually interesting point. So when you narrow the lane, the actual speed reduces, the actual traffic speed. And that, regardless of speed limit, improves safety. But it even improves safety in a greater way when you also reduce speed limit, posted speed. So the two together, I think there was one study that said if there's no changes in speed limit, just lane width reduction could reduce the speed, actual speed, about 2 to 3 miles per hour. With posted speed limit reduction, about 5 miles per hour. So it helps.
Those are really good questions, by the way. It's one I'm wondering about. Anything else? Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, so narrowing roadways that aren't transit hubs, like, I go to College Park, like we're a massive public transit hub, usually get one coming through. If you take this to a federal level and you're trying to narrow roadways, how do you subsequently accommodate for behavioral change? Because a lot of the speed reduction sounds like it's largely driven by people, pun intended, by people, paying more attention while they're driving, which is a good thing, obviously. But what if you had, like, if you go to a state DOT and they're like, okay, we want to potentially narrow roads, how do you then subsequently talk to the policymaker about behavioral enforcement? Do you have to, like, suggest to them an increase in public spending or police presence?
So the question is, how does one accommodate the anticipated behavioral change? Does it need to have an enforcement component? Does it? I think what you're getting at is the carrot or the stick approach. Do we have to then go back and enforce that behavior? Are there behavioral changes that need to be funded in some way? And did I capture that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, many studies show the level of adaptability of drivers to street condition is amazing. So you make changes in the street, drivers immediately get the sense, and because that's the first goal of drivers, they want to drive safe. They don't want to be involved in a crash, and they just are looking for that tip point where they can drive faster but also safer. And the design of the street, like many of these studies that did before and after, they noticed that the changes in behavior for drivers is just happening just a few months after these changes without any enforcement by officials. So yeah, you might I don't know, you might be surprised, but drivers get much more information from their surrounding and street, and that informs their driving behavior than posted speed. Posted speed is not really an effective way to, or any other types of enforcement. It's the design of the street and is the sense that drivers get from that design of how safe is it and what are the risks associated with that.
Excellent. Well, at this point, I'm going to say that I'm sure we will continue the conversation moving on, but we are going to now turn it over to the next part of our agenda. There's been a little bit of a switch, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. But first, if we could get another round of applause for Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you.